Hi everyone, welcome to another video. I'm Olivia, and today we're going to be talking about a topic that I think has crossed most artists' minds at some point. Digital or traditional painting? What are they? What are the main differences between them? What are their similarities? What are the pros and cons? And which one should you be using for creating your art? Do you have to just pick one, or can you use both? These are the kinds of questions we're going to be answering in today's video, while I'm going to briefly go over the differences between these two mediums and breaking down their pros and cons respectively. So let's dive right in and start talking about traditional and digital painting. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with both traditional and digital painting, but we're going to start off with traditional because it's traditional. Traditional artwork can happen in a wide variety of mediums. You could use oil paints, inks, acrylic, gouache, watercolours, charcoal, pencil, pen. Anything that requires a physical medium that you are painting or drawing on by hand in a physical sense is a traditional medium. And when you're working through this method of traditional painting, it usually requires your patience and your skills to plan how you're going to go about doing the piece. Depending on the medium, you're going to plan how you're going to approach the piece differently. Say if you're working on watercolours, you're going to start with really light washes and then slowly building up the light washes of colour into more defined shapes as you build into the foreground of the painting. Same if you're working on something like oil paints, you're going to work from very thin layers of oil paint at the back of the canvas, and then as you build up to the foreground and the layers build up on top of each other throughout the painting, you're going to be using less and less medium and more paint as you build that piece up. When you're doing work with traditional mediums, you typically will require a setup and some space. You're going to have to buy quite a few materials like paintbrushes, canvases, paper, whatever you need to actually do those things. Now that we've briefly gone over what traditional painting is, we're going to go to the other side of the spectrum, which is digital painting. So with digital painting, you don't have a wide variety of different mediums to select from. So you don't have like a huge variety of different canvases and boards and paper that you work on. You have a tablet, which is like a standalone device, like an iPad or a Samsung tablet, or you have a separate tablet which is connected to your laptop or your PC, which can either act as an extender, like a whole new screen that you can draw on with a stylus pen, or it could just be like a trackpad kind of thing with a pen attached, and you still have to look up at your PC screen when you're sketching. And something like the Wacom Bamboo or Wacom Cintiq are two examples of those two different things. So on these tablets you can then download a software which acts as sort of your selected canvas medium that you choose to use, and you can use lots of different types of softwares, but I think fundamentally all of these software basically do the same thing. So you could use something like Procreate or Photoshop on the iPad, you could use Photoshop or Paint Tool Sai or Autodesk Sketchbook on the laptops, and you basically have a selection of the entire spectrum of the colour wheel. You can work in both RGB and CMYK, so that's for digital or print, and you can basically download and create your own brush textures that will mimic what it looks like to paint with, I don't know, oil paints for example. So if you wanted to create a brush that looks like you're painting onto a woven canvas, you can create a brush that kind of mimics the effect of painting onto a woven canvas by creating your own brush or downloading a brush pack from online. But generally you have like that one expense at the beginning, and that's your iPad or your tablet and the software, and after that you don't really need to buy any more materials or anything like that for when you're working on your pieces. Okay, so now that we've briefly gone over what digital painting versus traditional painting are, we can now take a look at these two different ways of working side by side and compare them. So let's start off with the pros. So for traditional painting, I think one of the biggest pros is that you have one unique, tangible painting at the end of creating it. So when you get to the end of creating a painting and you've put a lot of time and effort into it, you then have this physical, one-of-a-kind, unique painting, which it doesn't exist anywhere else, and it doesn't matter how good the photographs you take are or how well you might scan that in and then photocopy it or try and replicate it, that will always be the original painting, and that's something that people find very valuable and very precious, and it's something that I think a lot of people still attach really strongly to traditional painting for. Next, you also have a beautiful, tangible experience when you're painting. There's something really nice about when you're doing a physical painting and you can feel the brush on the paper or the canvas and you can build up textures. There's a very tangible, responsive experience about painting in a physical, traditional medium. Next, when you're working in traditional painting and you've really gotten used to your chosen medium and you feel very confident in that, you can see that the paints and everything are going to work in a very predictable and easy to understand way. And when you really understand your medium, you can actually manipulate the physical properties of how your medium works so that you can create your own unique style. And it's the way that people use mediums such as oil paints or watercolors can become a real signature part of your style and how you work as an artist. Traditional painting also feels really authentic. There's something very nice about going through the process of setting up your space, getting your studio ready, getting all your paints ready and mixing up the paints and physically experiencing the creation of your painting and going through that process of methodically working from the underpainting into the foreground. Another pro that I personally find when I'm doing traditional painting is that I like that I'm able to just be completely present in the moment and there's no interaction with digital or technological stuff whatsoever, so I can just turn my phone off, put my iPad away, not worry about my laptop or anything. Maybe I'll have some music playing in the background quite often, but I'm not really spending time looking at a screen and I'm really just engaging with being physically present in the moment. It takes a lot of energy and concentration and you really are fully present for that entire experience and you're not really being distracted by the normal stuff that we all get distracted on when we go on our phones and our tablets and stuff. Right, now for the pros for the digital painting. So the pros for digital painting is that it's super convenient and easy to travel around with. When you get an iPad, you can literally go anywhere in the world anytime with that iPad and you can paint and create beautiful artwork from a hotel bedroom. You could do it in an airport when you're waiting to go for a flight. You could do it on the bus, you could do it on the train. You could create artwork when you're just about anywhere because it's so compact and easy to travel around with. That's not so much the case when you have a tablet that you're connecting to your laptop. The second thing about digital painting that's really great is that it's a really forgiving medium. You can make mistakes and just click undo. You can create layers on top of layers. So if you want to go back and add something into the underpainting or the background after you've finished doing loads of elements in the foreground, you can do that. It really allows for a lot more flexibility. And I think even though you do still have to think about it, and there's definitely a methodical approach to working digitally, you can definitely find clever ways around doing paintings and creating artwork, and it can really add a new layer of complexity to your pieces because you can go in and you can edit things later on and you can make things a lot more flexible throughout your process when working on a digital painting. Something else that's really cool about digital painting is when you are creating elements, say if you're creating a landscape with pine trees and a pine forest, if you don't want to have to draw out loads and loads of pine trees, you can just copy and paste huge clusters of pine trees that you've created before. Or if you're feeling really jazzy, you can create yourself a brush which looks like a pine tree and you can just do this and there'll be pine trees everywhere. The features of digital painting, such as Procreate on the iPad, for example, also gives you a huge ability to manipulate existing assets. So if I was to draw someone's face and I realise halfway through that I've painted her face slightly out of proportion, I could select a section of the face and I could warp and manipulate the proportions of that sketch so I can turn that painting into something that looks more the way that I would have liked it to look. Whereas in traditional painting you probably would have to go in and repaint that whole section again. You can also zoom right in when you're doing digital painting, which allows you to go into detail a little bit more on maybe a smaller canvas size. You could be working on something that's A4 in print size, but you can zoom right into it way more than you could if you were working on a traditional piece. There is no mess involved with digital painting. It really just requires you to have your iPad, grab it out, you can put it on your lap or put it on a table in front of you and you can just start working straight away, and there's no mess or setup required whatsoever. Digital painting also has a large upfront cost, but long term you're not going to spend any more money on materials. Obviously you might spend some money on materials if you're purchasing brush packs and stuff like that, but generally once you've paid for the upfront cost of buying a tablet and buying the software, you don't have any more costs involved with creating digital artwork. When you start to get a little bit more expert and comfortable, you also have the great capability that you could create an infinite number of brushes and textures that you can use within your artwork. That, you know, you could create textures that look like watercolors, textures that look like oil paints, that look like canvases, but you can also create crazy things that you might not be able to create with traditional painting. So now that we've outlined the pros of these two different ways of working, what are the cons? So for traditional, I guess one of the biggest cons is the continuous cost that is required and the materials that need to be used. So when you're working on traditional, you are going to constantly have to buy more paper, you're going to have to buy more paints, more canvases, more materials, more paintbrushes. You're going to have this long-term spend of materials just to keep the craft going. And also there's a long-term amount of space that's going to be accumulated. I mean, I have boxes and boxes of paintings that I've created throughout my life that just kind of are existing in a storage space, because every time you create something, that physical thing has to go somewhere. And if you're not selling that to someone or putting it in an exhibition or giving it to someone as a gift, that's probably just going to end up somewhere taking up some space. Speaking of this amount of space required, there's also a lot of space that's required for setup. It depends on what kind of material you have. If you're creating traditional work with pencil or charcoals or pastels or something, then it doesn't really require that much space. But if you're working on something like oil paints, they require a lot of ventilation, so you're going to need a lot of space to ventilate a room and make sure that there's good airflow, so you're not getting any inhalation of toxic chemicals from the oil paints and from the mediums that you're mixing the oil paints with. So there's quite a lot of space required when you're doing painting in some cases. Another thing is the cleanup and the messiness. There's a lot of mess that's involved with painting traditionally, particularly if you're using paints such as acrylics. If they get on your clothes, they are never coming out. So I never really like to wear nice clothes or anything that I would be upset if I got destroyed when I'm doing any kind of traditional painting. So it's always something to consider, that you need to have a space that is, you know, you don't mind if it gets a bit messy, or it's easy to clean up if it does get messy. Another thing with traditional painting is that it takes a long time to master certain mediums, and when you do come onto working with a new medium, or you are working on defining your skills with a medium, you have to really be constantly thinking about your approach and how you're going to be using the various properties of that particular type of painting, so that you can create the desired outcome. So it takes a long time to develop skill with each of these different mediums. I could be really skilled with gouache painting and with pencil drawing, but then try and pick up oil paints having never done it, and it would take a long time for me to develop the skills to be able to be a really effective oil painter. And yes, I think if you have experience using some types of paint, you can probably adapt a lot more quickly to other mediums, but I also think there's always going to be a learning curve every time you pick up a new type of paint and try and figure out how you're going to use that for your particular style. One of the biggest drawbacks of traditional painting when comparing it with digital is that you can't undo your mistakes. So you could be working on the most beautiful painting ever, and you could trip and drop your paintbrush and it can just spill a big black mark down the middle of your canvas, and unfortunately there's nothing that you can do to undo that. You're going to have to paint over that, wait for it to dry and see if you can resolve it. And that's a big drawback of traditional paint, is that it is vulnerable to being messed up quite easily if you make a silly mistake. So you have to really be quite methodical in your approach when you're working on traditional stuff, and be really careful not to mess up a beautiful piece, which sometimes might mean that you have to work with a lot more precision and a lot more time and effort. You have to make sure that you're not rushing into making a decision when you're placing a certain colour or a certain mixture of paints onto your canvas or your piece of paper. So now moving on to the cons list for digital painting. The biggest con for digital painting, in my opinion, is that you will never have an original piece. So you could create a beautiful digital painting and there's not really any way of you saying that this piece could never be copied or reproduced in an exact form and that this is the original. I guess you could argue that the piece that's on your iPad or on your laptop that you painted and it's like the first one that you ever saved, you could argue that that's the original, but it can be copied and reproduced with absolute perfection in multiple different places, and in a lot of people's eyes that can make it lose its value. It's obviously not the view of many people, but there is definitely a select number of people who believe that traditional painting is more valuable because you can always have that one original and there's no way of replicating it exactly. And with digital painting you can always replicate that same piece again and again and again. And I know there's this whole craze at the moment with NFTs and crypto art, but it's a way of trying to verify whether or not a piece is authentic and it's an original. But there's so many drawbacks with NFTs in terms of like the environmental impacts and stuff. So in my mind, I don't really see it as a valid solution yet for authenticating art as an original, but maybe in the future it might happen, and that might resolve this issue with digital painting that you can never really have an original. So I guess that kind of brings me on to my second con, which is sort of similar to the first one, and that's that once you finish your painting, you haven't got a physical, tangible thing that you can look at and you can put up on the wall and you can enjoy. You can print it and it will look incredible, but it's still not quite the same as when you have a traditional painting and you finish that traditional painting and you can see the textures of all the brush strokes and the brush marks, and you have like a bit of a three-dimensional texture to the paintings where you build up all the layers over a long time of working into your canvas or your painting again and again. So that kind of element of tangible experience is really missing from digital painting, and you always have to have your iPad or your phone or something present so you can show somebody, oh, this is the thing that I just created. And of course, when you print something off, it looks incredible, and we live in a world where so many things are digital now. So it's not a huge problem, I guess, because a lot of people do consume their media digitally in this day and age, but there is a real missing factor of a tangible experience when working on digital art. The next thing is, when you're working on digital paints, even though you can have a huge number of brushes that imitate the look and the feel of traditional mediums such as oil paints, watercolours, pencil and so on, it still doesn't quite look and feel the same. When you're painting oil paints with a pencil, an Apple pencil or something like that, it doesn't respond the same way as the real mediums would. When you're trying to blend colours and mix, you don't have like a water mixer that you can add into the mix when you're creating these paints and make them behave in the way that they would in the real physical world. So even though you can imitate the appearance of all of these different types of mediums in a digital format, you're still having to learn how to make them look the way that they would in a traditional sense, in a very different way to how you would apply them in a traditional sense. Another con about working on digital is that it's really easy to get really obsessed with the details, and because you can zoom in so much, that you start working on so many minute details that nobody is ever going to see, and then you zoom out on the canvas and you realise that the face that you've been painting for like an hour and a half is so small and so insignificant in the grand scheme of the piece that no one's ever going to see it. So there's definitely a tendency when you're working on digital work to sometimes overcomplicate your approach and go way too zoomed in and focus too much on the small details. Sometimes you have like such a huge number of brushes and things to choose from that it can be a bit overwhelming and you don't always know what you need to do. And I guess the last con for digital for me is that it's a lot of screen time. When you're working on digital work, even though you can get completely consumed in it and be totally present in the experience of creating that digital work, you're still spending a lot of time looking at a screen and not really disconnecting from the technological side of the experience, because you need it to be there in order to create the paintings. So it's just something to bear in mind. It's just to take some breaks and make sure that you're taking time to walk away from the screen, go for a walk, go and be in nature, spend some time away from the technology when you are working on digital work, because it can have a real impact on your sleep and a real impact on your mood and your concentration throughout the day, and it's really good for you to have some time when you're not looking at a screen. So now that we've briefly gone over those two different ways of working and outlined the pros and cons of each, I guess the question proceeds, which one should you be using? When should you be using them? And which one do you think is going to be best for your style? And for me personally, the answer that I came to when I was asking myself this question is that I like both for different reasons. I really love that traditional painting has that tangible, authentic feel to it. I love having a day where I can just sit down, I can disconnect from everything, crack up my easel and my canvases or my piece of paper and just paint something beautiful and just spend 8 hours or 12 hours or weeks just coming to my studio in my room and spending some time every single day just being disconnected and present when I'm creating a piece of artwork. It's really fulfilling for me when I finish a piece and I'm looking at it on the piece of paper or the canvas, and I have this tangible thing in front of me that I can be proud of, and I can put it up on my wall and I can show it to people, and I could even gift it to friends, and it's a really special gift for them because they know that it's the only one that exists in the whole world, and I really love that. I also just really love the way it feels to be experiencing the brushes against the paper and against the canvas, and to be mixing water and feeling that whole experience. You know, on the other side of that, I also really love digital painting because I love that the digital painting offers convenience. I mean, traditional painting is something that when I go traveling, it's something that's just not very accessible. I take a sketch pad with me, but I can't really take a whole set of paints and all my big A3 pieces of paper and just start painting anywhere I go. It's something that has to sort of be done with a bit of space and a bit of planning. And with digital painting, it's really great that you can just whip out your iPad wherever you are and you can paint and you can create beautiful artwork, and it's really detailed. And I know there's a bit of a tendency sometimes when you're doing digital artwork to maybe go into the details a bit too much, but I think when you get used to that process of working with digital paints and you can be a lot more efficient with it, it's a really convenient way of working. You know, when you're in client meetings, it's really great when you've got an iPad, because you could be sat in a coffee shop having a meeting with a client where you're just going over their idea. You could just get your iPad out and you could start sketching ideas right then and there that are really easily editable, and it's really cool. Overall, I really love both, and I like to jump between doing traditional painting and digital painting. It really depends on the kind of pieces that I'm creating and what kind of feel I'm going for, but I think that you can achieve a beautiful style that is quite congruent through both digital painting and traditional painting. The one thing that is just important to bear in mind, that it doesn't matter if you have an iPad that has amazing software and amazing features, or if you have traditional skills where you're painting on oil paints and you're really skilled in that. It's going to take you a long time to get good at anything that you pick up, regardless of if you've been painting your whole life and you pick up an iPad, or if you've been sketching on your iPad your whole life and you want to pick up digital painting, traditional painting. It's going to take a long time to develop that skill and that craft, and you have to give yourself time and patience to understand that different way of working and develop your own process and figure out what your style is and how you use those mediums to create your style. I had been doing traditional painting most of my life, and I bought my iPad about 1.5 years ago, and when I first picked it up, to be honest, I was completely lost. I had no idea what I was doing. I felt like I was never going to be good at it, because the way of working is so different to the way that you work with traditional mediums, and it took me a long time to develop my skill with digital painting to the point that I would put the work online and put it on my website and do work for clients in a digital medium. Just give yourself a bit of time and patience. Whichever thing you're picking up that you'd like to try, you will not be amazing at it when you first start. There's a learning curve, and after you get over that learning curve, it's great to just have a new medium that you can add to your repertoire of skills. I think there is nothing wrong with being good at digital and traditional and doing both of those things. I know we live in a culture where everyone's very pushed to be like, you have a niche and you're either a digital painter or you're a traditional painter, or you're an oil painter or you're a pencil drawer or whatever. But I think it's really important that if you want to experiment with things, you experiment, and I don't think that your style is determined just by the medium that you use. I think it's determined by the way that you work, what your message is, what your vision is, what your work is all about on a fundamental level. So I think if you want to experiment with using both, you don't have to make the choice between one or the other, and I think they're both really great choices. Thank you guys. I hope you found this video useful, and I hope this has answered some of your questions about digital versus traditional painting. Let me know in the comment section below, what mediums do you like using? Do you prefer traditional or digital? Are you thinking about trying another one? And if so, what are you thinking about trying? Thank you so much guys for your time and for watching, and I look forward to seeing you soon in the next video. Bye!